What's up, Internet? You're tuning in episode 76 of the FlipScreen Games Podcast, a weekly video game podcast where a group of best buds from different nations come together to discuss the wide world of video games. I'm your host, Pete and Bessie, joined, as always, by my partner in crime, Mr. Stephen Radford.
Hello.
You know, so, Steve, I was thinking about it, right? Partner in crime, and I'm like, well, we
I
definitely
was
do
literally
some.
like, what crime are we committing?
We do some crimes together, right? Like, it happens, you know. But, like...
What, like copyright infringement?
Sure,
but
sure.
I don't know about, I don't know about anything other than that. Is that a crime? That's not even a crime. That's like a civil thing, right? Copyright infringement. You can't go to prison for copyright infringement.
I don't know. I honestly, I'm not sure what the limits on that one are. Probably not. But just because it only goes to civil doesn't mean it's not a crime, right? Like,
So they're like criminal thing. I don't know. Maybe it's different in the US because you have like misdemeanors and like whatever
Sure.
the other ones, felonies. Yeah,
here's the thing: we're not criminologists, right? So we don't, we're not gonna know the intricacies here. But
I don't speak for yourself. I've played all the CSI games. I'm very good at.
Then why don't you know? You should know. I thought you were ready. You know,
those are like literally to pick the dust powder up and put it on the fingerprint.
I need a game that's actually going to teach me. You know, I need a game that's going to really help me develop the detective
Play the Nancy Drew games. She knows everything about the world of crime. Do you know what? Do you know what the real crime is? The fact that there was never a Murder, She Wrote game. And now poor Angela Lansbury is no longer with us.
Right? Like, she easily could have just dominated the video game world. But I'll tell you what is dominating my attention in the video game world right now, and it's PlayStation. We got a big PlayStation episode today. We all know I'm a Sony pony, right? Of course. Not let alone the fact that I'm, right now playing two games. None of them are on PlayStation. But, I'm such a fanboy, of course. But we got something to talk about this week that is like right in the Venn diagram, right? We know I love PlayStation. We know I love Marvel. We got an update on Insomniac's Wolverine, and we're going to kick things off there. I am very excited to have a little bit of rumbling around this game because, of course, first revealed during the PlayStation Showcase event back in 2021, was supposed to be targeting a fall 2024 window. We got some updates today about a slight delay, which is, a little disappointing, but of course, Insomniac.
That's actually unusual for Insomniac, right? I feel like they don't usually slip.
Very, very rarely. But you got to think, right? They're juggling a lot of balls right now. You got to imagine
2 on its way this year.
Yeah, Spider-Man 2 is on its way. I'm confident they're going to hit that date. You got to imagine that there's some work being put into what the next Ratchet and Clank looks like after the success of Rift Apart.
I also think that's being ported to PC. I think that's coming, so I feel like they're probably assisting with that.
So point being, they got a lot going on, right? So not disappointed to hear of a slight delay, but very excited to hear some of the context that was provided along this news. So let me take you on a walk. During an episode of Game Mess Mornings, which is a Giant Bomb podcast, journalist Jeff Grubb was talking a bit about Marvel's Wolverine. And if you're not familiar with Jeff Grubb,
never heard of him.
he's one when his rumors you can take to the bank, right? Like I think, I can't remember the last thing he talked about that didn't end up having a kernel of truth in it, right? So when he gives me a rumor, I get excited. Let's put it that way. So he said that based on what he knows, Wolverine is going to have an M for mature rating, which is interesting because that makes it one of only 9 games featuring Marvel characters that will have received an M rating. And 2 of those, unsurprisingly, were Wolverine games. So right on track for what I think you'd expect, right? One of the things that he specifically called out is that the game will feature dismemberment. You'll be able to tear people apart as Wolverine using his claws. Again, unsurprising. If you know
that thing, that's like actually what he does.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing, right? Is Wolverine is an interesting character, right? Because he is, I think much like Batman, right? He's a character that contains multitudes, and he can fit in kind of any environment, right? Because when he's a member of the X-Men, right? And he's, at the mansion and he's, like training kids, he's a teacher, right? And like, he's not going to have that same level of like intensity or ferocity, but he's also regularly like a black ops, mission type guy who's going out and eliminating dangerous targets and things like that. If push comes to shove, he will.
They should have made this like Marvel's, like Hitman Wolverine. They should make that. Like, I want to go on secret little missions and.
I'm interested to see how much of like where this is going to go, because like there's a lot of different kinds of stories you can tell with a character like Wolverine. Like he can do the whole like close to the ground, he's on his own, he's, traveling across the country on this mission or whatever, or he could be working with Shield or the Avengers or the X-Men, or he can go cosmic, he can go small. Like
that's got to be where they're going, right? To eventually like a decent Avengers game rather than the Square Enix one.
I don't know if they're going to be interested in doing that, because like I just feel like there's so much baggage that comes with that, right? Like if Insomniac decides they want to build towards something like that, then I'd trust them, right? Like I trust what Insomniac's vision is, especially with like what a good job they've done with Spider-Man so far. But I don't know. Like I feel like that's tough, to like have multiple characters that have different, movement styles and different attack styles, and like how do you make a game where it's like, oh yeah, instead of having one character who it feels really great to play for like 20 to 40 hours, there's like 5 characters that you can juggle, and like what does that look like? And I think the only way you could make something like that work is if you do like what they did with Guardians, and you pick like a focal point character where it's like, rather than it being like an Avengers game, it's the Wolverine game and the Avengers are in it and they're like supporting characters, but you just play Wolverine, right? Or like you play Spider-Man and you interact with these other characters.
Well, you play as other characters in Spider-Man, so
but they're all but like they're either another Spider-Man or it's boring.
Yeah, that's true. Very, very true. The boring sections are boring. But I'm interested. Can you, if you like Wolverine, if you climb up a tree, is it like a bear or a wolf? Can he not follow you?
No.
Is that a myth about bears as well?
Bears can definitely climb trees. So yeah, don't climb up a tree. The best thing you can do, just PSA, right? If you ever run into a bear, there's 2 things you can do. Be quiet and back away slowly and hope they lose interest. And if not, try to make yourself big and scream. That also only works with some kinds of bears, so be careful. All right? Do your fucking research. Don't mess with bears.
I'm okay. I live in a country where bears don't exist, so I'm okay. But we do have wolves, I think. Maybe we don't.
You can survive a wolf attack. If you're indecent, you might. But like a bear will kill you, so be careful.
I'm guessing Wolverine's part wolf, right? That's like where the wolf bit comes from.
A Wolverine is also a specific animal, just so we're clear. That's a different animal.
Is it really? Okay, right. I did not know this.
Yeah. So no, he's not. He's just got claws.
Okay. Oh my god, why did they pick that? That looks so pathetic compared to the actual Wolverine.
It just sounds cool, I think.
I think it's because
he's little and scrappy.
It has a reputation for its ferocity and strength.
Exactly.
And is a solitary animal. So I guess that makes sense for Wolverine.
And he's short. Like he's not a big. He's built, but he's like a small guy. So the idea of being like small and furious, I'm like, yeah, that tracks. You're good. So here's the other thing that Jeff added here, right? He said that the reason that the game is going to be taking a little bit longer, the expectation is now it's going to come in 2025, because they're planning on a lengthy development cycle, right? Revealed in 2021. Obviously, it's already been in development for some amount of time. Another 2 years since then. Another 2 years before it's supposed to come out. So you're looking at like 5-ish years, maybe a little longer.
Do you think it's because like the design changed? Because like Jeff also said in his reporting that it's going to give way to a God of War like semi-open wide linear design. Do you think initially it wasn't like that? It was more like a linear title where it was story driven? Because I presumed when they announced this, it was going to be like, oh, it's Spider-Man, but it's Wolverine instead, and it's an open world game, and you're going around a city. But it sounds like that wasn't the case.
So I never thought it would be that, just based on like what kind of character he is. Like that makes more sense.
Yeah, I mean, I know nothing about Marvel, so
so to give you the context, right? So you think about Spider-Man. Spider-Man as an open world game makes sense, right? Like as far back as Spider-Man 2, that's kind of what you would imagine it, right? Because when you think of like who Spider-Man is and what he does, that's his gig, right? Like when he's not in the middle of a specific conflict, he's literally just swinging around New York City waiting for somebody to need help, right? And then if he he'll jump in and lend a hand, and then he's back off to defend the neighborhood. So it makes sense, right? Like, he's a character who's very much about momentum, right? Like, a big part of Spider-Man's moveset and powers and everything are swinging around and having that sense of, like, freedom and being able to, like, move between the buildings and everything. Like, that is central to how you think about that character, right? Whereas, like, Wolverine, he has a motorcycle. Like, he can definitely get around, but, like, he's not a super, super mobile character. He's just a really, really strong dude who can heal and has claws and a metal. He has, like, it's called adamantium is the metal, and, like, the thing that happened is he was born with his mutant ability is just they were just claws, and as part of a experiment, basically, he like lost a bunch of his memories, and he was, like, put under, and they, like, covered his entire skeleton in this adamantium, so he's extremely durable, and he was able to survive that because he has a healing factor, so he heals basically instantly, right?
Do you know, like, where in the timeline this game is going to take part based on the trailer? Because I know we saw the trailer. He was like in the pub kind of thing.
Yeah, he's like, it was like the aftermath of a bar fight, right? And it's like, that could be anywhere on that timeline, right? It's like that could be before he joins up with the X-Men. It could be he's already a member of the X-Men, but he's off on a solo adventure, That's the thing, right? It's like Wolverine is one of those characters where I think you can kind of stick him in any situation and it makes sense because the character is, like, broad enough and has enough, depth that he can fit in a lot of different situations. And also, based on, his kind of journey as a character, he often goes off and kind of goes on his own solo adventures and then comes back and, resyncs up with the X-Men and the like kind of found family that he has there. So yeah, I mean, it could really be either way. My hope is that it is like he's already kind of established as a character, rather than an origin story. I think that worked really well with Spider-Man. I liked that Insomniac's version of Spider-Man, right? Like, they kind of, you meet Peter. He's already been Spider-Man for several years. He already knows all of his major villains, or most of them anyway. His dynamic with, like, Mary Jane is already established. Like, it felt good to enter that world and be like, cool, like, I know enough about Spider-Man to, like, have a baseline of, like, this is who he is and what his life's like. Now let me figure out, like, what are the intricacies and nuances of this specific version of that character. So I kind of hope that's what they do. I'd rather them kind of, like, he's already a member of the X-Men. He's off on his own doing this thing. Maybe we get a cameo from, like, a couple characters that he's friendly with here or there, or villains that he regularly goes up against. I think they did such a good job of that previously that I kind of just want to see them mirror that same storytelling technique. And to answer your initial question, I feel like, to me, rather than it being like a pivot, I imagine they probably just took a lengthier development cycle because it's not the kind of game that they usually make. Like, a lot of their last several games have been like,
yeah, but it's obviously slipped, right? Because it slipped from that initial launch window of fall 2024, and it slipped back into 2025. We obviously don't know when in 2025 that is. It could just be, it's their big January release, and they're going to launch it, and that, like, starts off the year with a blockbuster. Or it could be back half of 2025, in which case they've taken a whole year of additional development time.
But to me, I don't necessarily think that represents a pivot as much as it could just be like, this is a different kind of game than we've made before, so we want to take more time for polish because, like, a lot of their, right, like, you think about Ratchet and Clank is this very, like, it's a 3D platformer, but it's, like, very much like a third-person shooter, like, kind of a little bit of a pulled-back camera, running gun, wild weapon choices and stuff like that. They kind of extended that lineage when they did Resistance, although that was an FPS. And then, like, they have this, like, the lineage of, the, like, Sunset Overdrive to Spider-Man of, like, the light, you're flying around, it's like very speed-oriented, momentum-oriented. Wolverine is not like any of those, right? Like, if it is going to be more like, this is like a heavier character. It's more of like a brawler
Seems like something Naughty
action
Dog
title.
would make, like like emotional narrative is what Jeff Grubb described it as.
Yeah, and he said the development cycle is going to give way to a God of War like semi-open, wide linear design, which gives the player a larger than average area to explore and tackle as they see fit, jumping from core mission to core mission. And then this is a direct quote from Grubb. Even though Marvel's Wolverine is very early in development, from what I've seen of its emotional narrative and cutting-edge gameplay, the team is already creating something truly special. So, like, to me, that just gives the impression that, like, they know that they're on to something and they want to just take their time to get it right. And they have the bandwidth to do that because, A, they deliver bomb games. And also, to the point you made earlier, when's the last time they had a date slip? Like, it's very rare. So if they go to Sony and they're like, hey, we need another year to really, like, nail this.
Look at their capacity, right? They've released 3 games on PS5 and there's some PlayStation studios that have not released a single game yet.
Almost none of them have. When you really get down to it, right? Like, I guess you could give Naughty Dog the pass on Last of Us Part 1.
Well, they got Part 1. That's a release, yeah.
Yeah, but it's like, it's also not the same as making 3 totally unique, new, fresh games, right?
Yes. Yeah, very true.
I think by the end of this generation, Insomniac is going to have to be looked at as, if not the best PlayStation studio, probably the most important PlayStation studio or the most valuable PlayStation studio, because you got to imagine Wolverine is going to sell similarly to Spider-Man.
I feel like the difficulty is Naughty Dog is bringing value elsewhere, like with their HBO show, with their movies, like the stories that they create are unique.
They make like
and
prestige
new and their own IP.
Yeah. But that's the thing, right? Is like, okay, that's great and everything, but like, if they're only putting out one game a generation that's actually a new game, it's like, that's
that's fair. But then you get like
it's not bad. It's just different.
You get a blockbuster TV show or a movie out of it as well.
Yeah.
Like you get your money's worth.
For sure. But it's just funny because I think everybody would probably broadly agree that it's like Naughty Dog is like the crown jewel studio. Maybe you argue that Sony Santa Monica is on that same level, if not.
Gorilla's on that list as well.
I think they're more in the tier below that, though, where it's like, I think of like on the hierarchy, right, of like prestige studios from PlayStation. I feel like it's like Naughty Dog and Sony Santa Monica are like S tier. Then you've got like Insomniac, and to a lesser degree, Gorilla in that like A tier. I think Sucker Punch is on that level now with Ghost of Tsushima being such a big hit. And then you've got like your
Sony consider
and your
Polyphony up there, though. I really think Sony consider Polyphony Digital up there because they get to put out like one Gran Turismo generation. Sony seems absolutely happy with that, and it's like no problem, carry on. But yeah, I see what you.
You know what I mean? Like I think Insomniac does not get the same level of respect as those studios because they don't make the, this is a 10 out of 10 game of the year. This is, the most emotional narrative in video games. Like, that's not what they do. Like, they're more of like they make really, really fun, like frenetic, like games that feel great and play great and are fun. And like,
sounds like that might not be the case with Wolverine though. And maybe they are aiming for that. Yeah.
Like maybe I don't know. Like, I would love to see them get more respect put on their name because I think that I
agree with you, but I also don't want to see them. I don't want to see them lose their roots because I love the games that they make.
Me too.
The games that they've always made, and I don't just want yet another kind of Naughty Dog style studio there.
Yeah. I don't want them to chase that, but I'm more like, is it possible for them to like reach that next echelon where like the Spider-Man 2 comes out and you're like, this is a 10 out of 10. This is a game of the year. Like, it doesn't matter that it's Spider-Man. It's just, this is a fucking great game, right? Like, this is as good as God of War, as The Last of Us, as whatever. And I don't know that people will ever give it that because they're not these like serious dramas as much, but
I wonder if people see it as licensed properties, maybe they don't consider them as prestigious.
But even Ratchet and Clank, right? It's like Ratchet and Clank is not the same thing, right? Like it's a kids movie, right? Like it's more akin to that than it is like a prestige drama. And they made a Ratchet and Clank movie and it didn't, light the world on fire. Like it's different, and I don't think that they need to chase that at all. And I agree with you. I don't really want them to. It's more like I would love to see us get to a point where it's like, hey, like the next the next game from Insomniac is talked about in that same breath, because I think that they're as good as those studios in a lot of ways, but I think in terms of just like raw value, they have to be the most valuable studio in Sony's portfolio right now in terms of just like raw output of high quality games, right? You made the point. This will be their third game on PS5 before anybody, Sony Santa Monica got their one. There will probably not be another PS5 game from them out this generation, right? Like maybe Corey
Depends how long the
Barlog's
generation goes on, because if this is 2025, I could see, what Corey's got going on. I could see that coming 2026.
Or maybe that's one of the like last big games on PS5, but it's the development cycles for these games are just getting longer and longer, right? And it's I don't know. I don't know that.
But I think the generations are going to get longer and longer because we're already 3 years in.
Yeah,
we're talking about a game that's another two, maybe 2.5 years away.
We're in a recession too, which was the thing that
at that point, that's 6 years after the PS5 was released. It's you're coming up on the 6th year.
And the longest console generations always coincide with economic, slowdown, basically. So it's not crazy to think that.
Yeah, it's interesting, and what I also thought was crazy is because you mentioned that we get one game from Naughty Dog a generation. That was only last generation. Think about the PS3. We got Uncharted 1, 2, and 3.
We did get 2 from them last gen. Now that I think about it, 3 technically.
We got 3 from them from last gen. Yeah,
you're right.
We got a decent amount. So
4 Lost Legacy, and then
exactly, yeah. So we've got The Last of Us Part 1. We're gonna get the multiplayer title because we know that that's in production, and we're probably gonna get another story-driven title that's not Uncharted. Although there was the rumor that there was a tease in the latest PlayStation 5 advert, which I think is nothing, but another studio maybe taking over the torch for Uncharted. I could see that happening.
That would still be a really dramatic reduction, though, when you think about it, right? Because PlayStation 3, Naughty Dog put out 4 games that were big AAA marquee titles. They did 3 the next generation. Now we're looking at 1. Because, I'm sorry, no disrespect. I defended Last of Us Part 1. I'll do it again.
Well, I think you're going to see
I don't count that as
a
fresh
I
release.
do think the multiplayer title. I think the multiplayer title can be considered a AAA release.
So 2 then, right? That and one game maybe. Dramatic.
I mean, we don't know what they're working on. It could be something else though. They could have something else on the go.
And it's interesting too because it's how far into their next project are they? Neil Druckmann is the creative director of the studio, and he's working on this TV show.
Yeah, that TV show, it seemed like it was only the first episode that he was really involved in. All the other ones...
He directed the second one, I think.
But the other ones were written by... They were written by Craig, so I don't know.
I don't know. It
was obviously there for story and narrative and development, but the same way that Miyamoto was off, making movies and theme parks and stuff. Nintendo didn't grind to a halt. They still made games.
Not quite the same though, right? He's a C-level executive at Nintendo, and he's certainly involved in things, but Neil Druckmann is the creative director of the studio, right? He's the guy, and I don't mean that as disrespect to anybody else. That's the role that Naughty Dog has put him in, right? Where they're a more auteur-driven studio where it's the director is such a force in what happens, right? I don't know. It's interesting. I'm very interested to see what PlayStation's output is going to be when all is said and done with this generation. Because it's you're right that we are early in, and you got to imagine that the pandemic and all those things have
it's not really early in. This is the 3rd year now, and it's we're into now the 3rd year. I've had my Xbox and my PlayStation 5 for 2 years at this point, and it's
this November
we've not really seen anything.
Year 3.
Yeah,
right?
It will be year 3 going into year 4. So it's it's been a good while. I feel like in previous generations, and I know the pandemic obviously has played a huge part in this, that we'd seen more titles by this point. In 2015, for example, I feel like that's when the PS4 really kind of kicked off.
We did
if we
this
look
once.
At games released in 2015.
We did this once. So if we're talking about major retail releases, right? First year on
2015 is when it really kicked off. Looking at it,
2015 is where it was where it opened up. Because you had some bigger games like from their portfolio. Like there was like Killzone Shadowfall, Infamous, Second Son, Little Big Planet 3, stuff like that. But it's like 2015 is where you start getting into, I think, a lot of the games you like associate with PlayStation. Like Bloodborne came out that year. That was when we got Until Dawn, right? Like things like that. And it's like
still not much released from PlayStation Studios then. It's like that's when I feel like the generation really kicked off. We've got The Witcher 3, we've got Fallout 4.
I think that's the thing, though. I honestly
that.
don't think we're in that much of a dissimilar situation 3 years into the PS5. Like, you're right. Obviously, like, pandemic affected those things. But, like you said, like, 2015 is where it starts gearing up. It's like 16 is where it actually, like, right? Because it's
Which
like...
is the year we're in now. 2016 is the year that would be the third year that we're going into. So it launched like November 2013.
Is that right?
Going into like
because it launched 2020?
Yes, launched 2020. So we're now in the third year. So it would be games released this year that you'd have to compare it against. So it's like Uncharted 4 came out in 2016.
So I gotta say, like when you think about it in that context, I actually think we're better off this generation already. Because
the launch lineup for the PS5 was great. Like the launch window was significantly better.
Like
than
Demon's
the
Souls, Ratchet and Clank, Miles Morales. Like that's a better launch lineup than the PS4, than the first 2 years of the PS4, I think.
Yeah.
And then when you add, so then we also have God of War and Horizon. I think that's huge. Like those, like we didn't get those caliber of games until the back half of the PS4, and we already got them. And then we know Spider-Man's coming this year. God of War is coming next year, right? Like, I'm sorry, that's not what I meant. Spider-Man's this year. Wolverine's 2 years after that. I'm thinking of the God of War style gameplay.
Yeah, and there probably is going to be Spider-Man DLC next year, I would imagine, to tide people over.
Right. Maybe like a Miles Morales 2, who knows, right? Like things like that as well. Potentially cards they could play. And we know we have factions, right? Last of Us multiplayer coming and things like. So it's like, I find the narrative very interesting that people are like, oh, there's like no games, but it's like I feel like when you actually compare it, it's like you're comparing the end of a console generation to the beginning of one, and like that's always
a lot of people do that. Yeah, I know, but look, this year's looking, a bit barren for.
It's just Spider-Man, right? Like that's it, But again,
or PSVR 2, because PSVR 2 is a very big focus for them at the moment.
True,
and that's like due out next month. We've had a story that we'll talk about in a little bit, but they've got a lot of titles coming out for that specifically.
Yeah, which I mean that probably influences things too, right? Like there's only so much marketing energy you can put towards something in a year, right? And if you're like expecting people to buy expensive hardware, how many do you want to put out games that are gonna get cannibalized, things like that? Like, yeah, that's a good point. But it's interesting, right? Because like you said, like we would need to compare this year to like 2016, and I think if you compare this year to 2017, it's like not that different, right? Because like 2017, they had Horizon and then a bunch of small stuff, right? Like Lost Legacy came out that year as well. But then it's like it's a lot of, like Gravity Rush 2, GT Sport, Knack 2, like Everybody's Golf. Like, like we could see games like that this year, right? Like we could have, PSVR comes out, Call of the Mountains, big launch title, Spider-Man comes out in the fall, that's the big fall game, and maybe we get like another like couple, middle tier like indie type things in the interim.
Like AA.
Yeah, like we know that they're planning on launching live service games this year. We know that, Bungie has projects in development. It's not crazy to think that they'll have things to reveal.
We do know
Bungie's
got other projects in development, but they're probably going to be released on other platforms. So I don't necessarily think you can consider those because Bungie is their like third-party publishing arm. They've given them kind of carte blanche to put their games wherever they want, from what they said during the acquisition. Anyway, whether that remains to be seen or not.
Yeah, so I don't know. I guess the point being is like I don't think we're actually that far off in terms of like parity between the release schedule we were used to on PS4.
Yeah, let's bring this topic we were going to talk about up to this discussion. I think it's relevant. The E3, obviously, we know PlayStation's not going to be there.
Right.
What do you think their plans are? Like, do you think we're going to get a big summer showcase like Xbox is doing? Do you think they're just going to do like a state of play and just like show off a few trailers and maybe lump that in, or maybe they'll be at Jeff's thing again like they were last year.
So I think this is probably one of the biggest conspiracy theories in gaming that I actually think makes sense. There was a lot of talk last year about did Sony there was a rumor that Sony had a presentation that they were ready to like produce or release, and that they pivoted and decided against that because of the ongoing legal battle surrounding Microsoft's acquisition of Activision Blizzard, right? And they were basically the theory is, right, they're trying to position themselves as being in a more vulnerable space than they are within the market, so that lawmakers will decide that Xbox's acquisition is, impacting competition in a negative way, right? And Xbox's argument is that Sony has enough of their own unique value drivers, right? That like that's why they're number one and Xbox is number three, right? And I think there's arguments on both sides of that are like, fair to some degree. So like, I don't know. Do I definitely think that's what happened? No, right? Like not necessarily, but it also makes a lot of sense because Sony always has a big presentation. Even in the past couple of years where they've not done E3, like they've had some kind of presentation. We had the PlayStation presentation in 2021 where we got the reveal of Wolverine, where we got more looks at Spider-Man 2 and things like that. They've been very quiet since then, right? We have not had major conversations about new software or like what their studios are doing, with rare exception, right? I think the only things I can think of are, like you said, the collaborations they had with Jeff, and like talking about factions a little bit.
Yeah, because they had the last thing we had was the 2022 State of Play, and the big draw there was God of War Ragnarok. I just think part of it could be that they just don't have enough to show yet, and
Maybe
they're not the studios aren't ready to show it off. But maybe you want to do like the tease announcements like they've done with Wolverine. But does that make sense to kind of show your hand so early when the games could be years out?
it's tough,
Especially
like,
when last year people were struggling to buy the consoles anyway. Do you
sure,
really want to spend that like amount of time marketing and putting together these trailers and taking people off of actually making the game to do these like
to make a vertical
gameplay
slice,
trailers
yeah.
and a vertical slice when you could just carry on selling every console you make anyway, because you can't make them quick enough, and then just being like, yep, this is the lineup we've got at the moment, and we'll reveal more soon.
And
But
frankly,
they
also, there's
were
not a
at
lot of
the Game
pressure from
Awards.
the competition right now either, right? It's not like, Nintendo's doing their thing, but like it's not like Xbox has had like a bunch of heavy hitters that have been like proving why you need to go to Xbox instead, right? Like I think they can kind of coast a little
But I
bit.
think this is potentially the year when that changes, with Redfall, with
Yeah,
Starfield, with Hi-Fi Rush has proven to be a big hit for
right.
them. That there's potentially titles now that are there. I mean, we did see a big announcement at the Game Awards from PlayStation. We had Death Stranding 2 was announced there, and we also
That's
had
true.
the Horizon Forbidden West DLC that was announced there. So that's obviously coming out this year as well. But
Yeah, so it's not like
uh,
we don't know. Like, yeah, that's a good point. I didn't think about the fact that the Horizon DLC is this year too. That's another big thing that they can like hang their hat on.
yeah,
Um,
gonna piss a lot of people off who bought that game on PS4.
yeah, is what it is, right? We'll have to
Yeah.
see how that shakes out, I guess. Um, but yeah, I don't know. Like, I could kind of see it going a lot of different ways depending on what the rest of the year looks like, right? Like, if that theory has any water and they are concerned about the ongoing, legal battle, then like maybe they keep holding their cards close to their chest because, as we're going to talk about in a minute here, right? Like sales of the PS5 are not slowing down. Like they don't really need like a ton of software to push the thing, especially when like a successor to the most popular first party game they published on the previous console is out this year. It feels like similar to
Mhm.
like what we've been talking about with Zelda and Tears of the Kingdom. It's like, how much more do you need in a year when you're releasing Zelda? How much more do you need in a year where you're releasing Spider-Man 2, right? Which is like those games have sold incredibly well. and they have a bigger audience now than they even did before because they were just on PC. It's like people are like, I think probably hungry for the next one. So like maybe that's all you need, right? And like they're happy to just be like, yeah, this is what we got this year. You know, we know that all the cool third-party stuff that you want to see is going to come
you've
here.
Also got the big third-party stuff as well, like Resident Evil's coming. We've got a bunch of other stuff that we know is coming. There's probably going to be Elden Ring DLC, which is going to be huge. So, yeah, you could be right. It could be enough that they've got one big game. That's all they need to kind of tide them over. And then also PSVR 2.
Right. Yeah, and it's like that's a lot. Like that's not a small offering. You know, so, and like they've done that before. Like again, you go back to the PS4 generation, the first couple of years of the PS4, there was not a big fall game, right? Like that was not a thing that they did. And even later in the generation, the two big games that came out the last year of the PS4 came out in spring, right? Like I think that they have realized that like their brand is stronger than Xbox's. The PlayStation brand is definitively stronger than the Xbox brand. And I think that's safe to say, especially, and it's funny because I know console warriors are going to come for me, right? But like, I think if you're a person who has an Xbox, it's very easy to point to all the things that the Xbox does better. But guess what? That has not materialized in the Xbox being more popular.
Yeah.
More popular than it was, yes, but not more popular than PlayStation. Not more popular than Nintendo.
Yeah, because we just had like a PS5 update, which brings features that should have been there at launch, right? VRR support for 1440p. Why was that not there when they did VRR support for 4K? It's like, why was that like separated? And it's added Discord voice chat finally, when they're the ones that invested in Discord and Microsoft got it first. It was kind of crazy. We still don't have proper folders over there. There's like a lot of stuff on the PlayStation 5 that leaves a lot to be desired. Themes went by the wayside, as we spoke about. But that could have been a choice, that they didn't want themes in the same way that Nintendo seems to have made that choice. I don't know. But we'll have to wait and see what they've got in store for us. I think we probably will see something in summer. I think we're probably going to see a tie-in with Jeff, even if it's just like a trailer for the Last of Us thing. Yeah. It's just like, oh, you know, we spoke about it here. We revealed it here. Here's The Last of Us. Maybe we see the PC release of The Last of Us Part 1 this year.
Or like maybe open beta for factions, right? Like I could see that being like, hey, like, and now you can go sign up for the beta. It starts next month, right? Or something like that. You know, not unheard of. It's interesting though.
Maybe they finally do a PS5 release of The Last of Us Part 2 as well as The Last of Us Part 1, have that collection.
Yeah, they do like The Last of Us collection Part 1 and 2 like in one box.
And then that gets you the open beta code or something. Yeah. I can see them doing something like that.
Or like special content, you know? Something like that. You get exclusive skins if you buy this version.
Yeah, I could easily see that.
Yeah, I think we're going to get a lot more Last of Us this year, that's for sure. We're going to be like sick of The Last of Us in like 2 years. All right, so we got some more PlayStation talk ahead of us, but before we get to that, let me remind you that this episode of the FlipScreen Games podcast is brought to you by our Patreon producers for the month of February. They are, of course, Anthony Gonzalez, Christian Oliveria, Christopher Valens, Earth Visitor, Gabriel Hasselmeyer, a.k.a. Asobi, Mary Berry, Ty the Dude, Wakahula, and Zaid Ida. Thank you all so much for your support over on patreon.com/FlipScreenGames. Y'all are the realest of the real, and we greatly appreciate your support of this and all of our sister shows. If you want to go and show your support on Patreon, if you want to write into the show, just like some folks did for the question block later, if you want to join our Discord and keep the conversation going between episodes, guess what? You can find links to all those things in one convenient location, and that is flipscreen.games. That's our website. Head over there. However you choose to show your support, we greatly appreciate it. And thank you for tuning in to another episode of the FlipScreen Games podcast. And I'll give you a quick plug. If you want to hear some more E3 conversation, go listen to this week's Nintendo Noise. We talked about this story a little bit more in depth and what it means for Nintendo's plans this year. So if you're at all interested in that, go check it out. So let's jump into another Sony story here. The PSVR 2 was getting some negative attention this week. There was a story that came from Takahashi Mochizuki over at Bloomberg. who, if you're a regular listener of the show, a regular reader of Bloomberg, you'll be very, very familiar with Takahashi's work.
Yeah, he's got deep links in the production line. That's how we knew about the OLED Switch coming.
The Switch
because he
Mini as well, right? Or not Mini.
Yeah,
what
Switch
the
Lite. I
called?
think
Switch
he
Lite.
reported on that as well.
I can never remember what that fucking thing is called anymore because I've literally only ever seen one in person.
Yeah. Do you know what? I've just remembered. We've also apparently got a new PS5 coming this year with the detachable drive. So we'll see if that comes as well.
Right.
Remember that story?
I do remember that story. Wouldn't be surprised if that's around the corner. Maybe that gets announced this year too.
Yeah, do a bundle with the VR too. I don't know why they haven't.
Yeah.
Weird.
That'd be interesting. Anyway, so direct quote from the story. Bloomberg states Sony has cut its shipment forecast in half. I'm sorry. This is actually from Eurogamer's write-up of the story. Apologies.
Yeah, only because I don't have a Bloomberg subscription. I'm very sorry. I'm not paying for it.
No, it's fine. I also have the same problem because I always want to read Jason's articles and can't. And it's like, well, okay.
Yeah, he does like the Cliff Notes version on his Twitter threads though, so I really appreciate that. Thank you, Jason, for letting us read your articles through tweets.
I was upset because he had 2 big exposés this week, and usually you can read like one for free. And I clicked on the one that was like only like 3 paragraphs, and the other one was the long story. And I was like, fuck, damn, like I had no idea. But oh well. So this is from the Eurogamer write up. And this is by Tom Phillips over at Eurogamer. So thank you, Tom. Tom writes, Bloomberg states Sony has cut its shipment forecast in half, down to 1 million units instead of 2 million after lackluster early interest. The company reportedly now expects to ship just 1.5 million headsets in total before March 2024. This got obviously a lot of attention. There was this narrative of like, does Sony not believe in the PSVR 2? Are they sending it out to die? Is it going to be a PS Vita situation? Sony did take the time to respond, interestingly enough, because not usually one to respond to this kind of like rumor, but probably behooved them to get out in front of this one, right? So they said, we have not cut PlayStation VR production numbers, and we are seeing enthusiasm from PlayStation fans for the upcoming launch, which includes more than 30 titles such as Gran Turismo 7, Horizon Call of the Mountain, and Resident Evil Village.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting their wording because it's not the same as what Bloomberg reported. They reported that shipment forecast would be cut in half, not the production numbers. So it's quite possible they're still going to make 3 million PSVR 2s, but they're just not going to ship all of them by next March.
Right. Yeah. And I feel like that's probably a worthwhile call out, right? PR responses are crafted very carefully. So I think that is a change that is intentional for sure. I would agree with you. What do you make of this? Like, do you take this as a where there's smoke, there's fire situation, and that they genuinely are less confident in that ability and they're trying to spin it? Is that kind of your read on this?
I think they are. It's a very expensive headset. We're in the middle of a recession. At least we are in the UK.
We're in one here, right? Like and if we weren't
$600,
if we weren't a couple months ago, it is now, right? Like,
yeah,
$600 is a lot.
It's a lot of money. $600 with a game, and the game you want, the game you'd be buying it for, Horizon Call of the Mountain. It's a lot of money to ask someone to pay for, especially when you look at the alternative headsets, right? That you don't need a PS5 for. They're struggling as well. You look at what Meta reported on their VR division. I think it lost like 13 million or something crazy. It was like a billion. It was a lot of money that they lost from the VR department.
I mean,
it's just
it makes sense broadly too, right? Because it's like not only it's an expensive product in the middle of a recession, it's a luxury item for your home, and I think that for better or worse, right? Like people aren't spending as much time as home as they were the last couple of years. People are less interested in investing in like hot items for the home than they are for like going on a vacation maybe for the first time in the last couple of years, or like going out to eat and going out to bars and things that are, less home oriented because you're free to do it now. Whether it's always the safe thing to do is a different question, but
Plus,
I
it's like there's cheaper ways to entertain yourself at home, and that's the thing, right? Entertainment is always one industry that never really suffers during a recession, and the problem is like it's not just gaming that's competing for my time. They've got to compete with Netflix, with Disney Plus, with the Last of Us TV show over on HBO. It's like, do I really want to be investing $600 into something to play potentially one game that I care about, and then have it collecting dust until they release the next big title
that's why
next year?
I'll
Or do
never
I want
buy
to wait?
I'll never buy a VR headset again. I don't think. Never say never. That's an exaggeration. In the current era of VR, I have no interest in a VR headset ever again. And that's why, right? Is that like it's a really expensive investment for something that is, I think, like no shade if you are a VR enthusiast. I think they are a novelty item. I think the way that we were talking about on the Steam Deck podcast this week, there are a lot of people who came at us for last week's show of that show where we were kind of doing a comparison between it and the Nintendo Switch, and it's like, it's this niche product. Who's this for? That's what I think VR is. Like, I think
VR is niche, at least in its current form.
Yeah.
It needs a cheaper entry point, and it needs to be lighter, easier. Everything about it needs to be simpler in the same way that video games took off because Nintendo made this thing that looked like a toaster and you put it under your TV and it worked.
And I also think again, I mean this with no shade. The medium of VR is in its infancy, but I also just think that like the offerings in VR are not up to snuff. Like, I don't think VR software is attractive enough to warrant the cost of entry. I really don't. I've never ever played a VR game that I thought was as enjoyable as playing a regular, well-made video game, right? Like, the best experiences I've had in VR are interesting for like maybe 20 to 30 minutes before it's like, I don't want this shit on my face anymore. I'm hot. My head hurts, or I feel nauseated, or, whatever, right? And it's like, yeah, it's cool for like a minute. And then it's like, all right, like, do I really want to do this on like a Tuesday night after work? Like, no, I really don't. I have no interest in it.
But enthusiasts definitely disagree with you. There are VR enthusiasts out there. And I think 3 million, 10% of the number of PlayStation 5s you've sold was not actually that ambitious of a target. Like 10% is a pretty good conversion rate.
I think that's pretty attainable.
Yeah, and it seems like what Bloomberg were reporting was they're now aiming for a 5% of the market, but we'll have to see if that remains to be true. I personally use my VR headset every day. I exercise with it, and I find it's a really fun and enjoyable form of exercise. But I would agree with you that most games I would prefer to play on a screen, on a TV, on a handheld, and that's fine. I feel like some experiences, something like Half-Life Alyx, it is more engaging if you play it in VR, and it's like, oh, I can touch every single item that's here, and I'd love to be able to experience that. And I think maybe Horizon Call of the Mountain is going to do that for PlayStation, but I kind of believe Bloomberg's reporting here that I don't think we're going to see, because like Bloomberg said that they're going to reduce down to 1.5 million headsets, so they were reporting 2 million, down to 1 million units instead of 2 million.
No. So they've reduced their shipment forecast in half from 1 to 2, but they expect to shift 1.5 by the end of March 2024.
End of the fiscal year. Okay, so this year will be a million instead of 2 million.
Essentially what Bloomberg is reporting is that they are expecting to sell 500,000 less in the year than they initially expected.
I could believe that. Like, it's an expensive product.
Yeah,
they can't have expected when they started developing this. Yeah, they can't have forecast when they started developing this that the world inflation rate would have skyrocketed to the point it has, and that the world would enter into a global recession again.
I also wonder if they didn't expect there to be problems getting the PS5 on shelves, right? And like that is like, has that impacted things? Because it's like, well, by this, like when we started development, we expected that there would be this many PS5s in the wild, and there's actually less than there were. So there's a smaller pool of people we can sell this to, right? Like that's a whole other thing, right? Let alone the fact that it's expensive and it's a niche product. you have to be somebody who's interested in VR and owns a PS5, and it's like that's not a huge Venn diagram of people, right? Like that's the idea that there are less than 2 million PS5 owners that want one is like that might be true,
or have $600 spare to spend on one right now.
Sure, right? You'd have to have the want and the means, and that's probably pretty unlikely, let alone maybe you're like, well, I'll get it when it's cheaper, or I'll wait until there's more software
That's,
that I want.
the thing. It's like, let's wait and see. That's because it's kind of like, oh, we've got one big title at launch that people really care about, and then we've got some adaptations of existing titles like Gran Turismo 7, Resident Evil Village. It's just like, yeah, but I want to play like dedicated VR titles that have been designed for this device from the get-go.
Yeah.
And Horizon Call of the Mountain's the only real big one that they've got going at launch, and then some ports from like Quest headsets, but that doesn't really show off the hardware that you're investing $600 into.
Yeah.
Why would you not just wait until next year or the year after when there's like 5 or 6 titles and you can invest the money, maybe you've saved up and you can spend that money and get into all the titles, or buy a used one, because I can imagine there's probably going to be a pretty hefty market of used ones in the next few months.
That's the thing, is like I feel like the only person who would do that is somebody who's wanted to get in on VR for years and just hasn't. Right? Like this would have to be your first headset for you to be like, yeah, whatever, that's cool. Like there's 30 games at launch. That's a lot, right? Like I've not played these games. Then yeah, that works for you. But like, again, like who is that person? Right? Because like I feel like if you were interested in VR, you probably bought a VR headset at some point. You might own one right now. And then it's like, are you playing these games on other platforms? Is it enough for you to buy it just to get Horizon? Like if you're already in the market for an upgrade, maybe, but then it's like if you already have one that's on PC, you're splintering your library. Like I don't know. Like it's I think they're in a tough position, honestly. And not because the hardware isn't good or that like it's not a well-made device, but like its use case might be too specific for the market as it stands now versus where it was a couple years ago when VR kicked off, right? Or like a couple years ago when they made plans to make this device.
Think Meta doubled down on it and have regretted that as well. And it's pretty clear that they're kind of rolling back a little bit and not being as bullish as they were.
But also that, right? It's like, I take that with a grain of salt because they're not a video game company. And like,
they own a lot of video game companies, though. They just bought another one.
Yeah, you're right. But they're not a video game company, right? In the same way that like we both read Jason Schreier's book, right? Like there was that whole chapter about the Mickey, God, what is it? The black and white one, Mickey's
Epic Mickey.
Epic Mickey, yeah, Epic Mickey and Epic Mickey 2. And the whole narrative there, right, of like why Disney got out of video games, right? They owned the Disney Infinity studio and everything, and like the reason they got out of games was because it was just too much trouble to be in games, right? I'm of the opinion that unless your entire business model is video games, or you're like a company like a Microsoft where you can have, a sub brand that is like a huge independent arm of your business, that being in video games is not worth it for a company of that size, right? You saw Google do this and then bail when it didn't pan out, right? Rather than continue to invest resources. I imagine Amazon is going to go the same way in a couple years, months, whatever, right?
Like, I don't know about that. They're publishing the Tomb Raider game.
Yeah, and like, but
maybe they just get into publishing in the same way
maybe,
that,
And maybe, right? And maybe they find a way to make that work in their business model. But I also wonder what happens when they publish this Tomb Raider game. They don't own Tomb Raider. They make this game. It's on multi-platform. It sells better everywhere else than it did on the Amazon streaming service. And it's like, so what did they get out of that?
I could see the streaming service die, but they'll just, I think publish on other platforms, because their Amazon game, I can't remember, what's that Amazon MMO called? That's been pretty popular from what I can tell. New World.
I thought it doesn't exist anymore. Didn't they get rid of it?
No, New World exists. It's on Steam.
Still around? Okay. Yeah, New World, that was the one.
Yeah, it's got mixed reviews. Recent reviews, very positive. Developed and published by Amazon Games. It's was released in September 2021, and it still seems to be prospering.
And maybe they're the exception that proves the rule. Maybe they're an outlier, whatever. But like, I feel like there are a lot more examples of non-gaming brands getting into gaming and then bailing than sticking around, right? Like, I think Apple
there are,
Arcade
I mean, look at
is
Sony,
probably
for
like
example. Though
the unique standout there.
Sony, you could be right, but like Sony wasn't a gaming company, and they got into it and did well. They made
you're right.
TVs and appliances and stuff,
and
like,
then now that's the focus of their business, though, right? Like, well,
to some extent it is. They've got a lot of focuses. They own a music label, they own movie studios, they own a lot of stuff.
But PlayStation is the most profitable part of their business, though.
It is, yeah.
And that's my point, is I think you need to be all in on video games. I don't think it's a thing you can do as a part of your business model. Unless there's like a specific use case, right? Like I think of Marvel, right? Marvel, not a video game company. They're a comic book company. They're an IP holder, right? But Marvel Games works because it's a sub-brand that contracts out work, and it's like, okay, we're licensing the IP. That's what this business exists to do. And maybe
that's what Disney Interactive was all about, and
that didn't work, right? Because they were not because they bought studios, because they didn't want to partner with studios, they wanted to own studios, and then they realized that the business of owning a game studio is not great business. It's
I think Konami figured that out, and now they're just getting third parties.
Same thing, right? Like they were a diversified business. Games were a small part of what they did ultimately, but it took so much of their resources and attention to do it. And it's really easy to invest a lot of money in building a AAA or maintaining a AAA video game studio, and then they spin out a flop. And you just wasted 5 years investing money into something that you're not going to see a return on. And that damages your IP that was valuable. It's a big gamble. And I think if you're not a Microsoft, a Sony, Nintendo, somebody where like that's your business, right? Like that is what you do.
But it's not even Microsoft's business. That's such a small aspect of their business.
But that's why they spun Xbox off, right? Because like
they haven't spun it off. It's not an individual separate. It's a separate company, but it's a sub entity of them.
Right.
Yeah, but like it's not a spin-off, like as in say they had to form a separate company, like eBay and PayPal are separate companies.
But if you'll recall, during the Xbox One generation, that almost happened. Like they almost sold off the Xbox brand entirely because they wanted to get out of gaming.
Yeah, and then thankfully they got a new CEO who saw sense.
And Phil Spencer, he doubled down and he
no, I'm not even about Phil Spencer. I'm on about Satya Nadella rather than Steve Ballmer. He was a terrible CEO.
But my point remains, right? Like even Microsoft, that owns one of the most successful gaming brands, almost bailed on gaming because it was too volatile. It was too risky.
Yeah, I don't think Meta's going to bail on gaming. I think they're going to backtrack on some of the business shit that they've been trying to sell. No one gives a fuck about Horizon Worlds or your workspace crap in VR. And no one wants to sit around a table. Like maybe this was a cool idea, like when we were all at home, working from home during the pandemic, and we all got sick of Zoom calls and going like, "Oh, you're on mute every 2 seconds." It was like that was a cool idea, but now kind of life has returned to somewhat normality where we're all used to just having video calls now, or working from home, or going into the office, having like a hybrid work lifestyle. I don't think we need that, but I do think that VR does have social aspects to it, like VR chat's very, very popular. And I also think there are aspects and there are some experiences in some video games that you can only do in VR. And maybe the market is, because I know they sell Quest for Enterprise as well. Maybe the market's like arcade, but maybe we should focus more on having like arcade experiences and things like that.
I've said that before. I think that makes so much more sense. Like I'm so much more excited by the future of like, what does a company like Disney, like the parks, right? Disney parks do with like VR, right? What is like Universal do with VR, right? Rather than
they've got something going on, don't they? They've got the AR thing at Nintendo World.
Mario
put
Kart,
the glasses
on
with the Mario Kart
element, right?
Yeah.
The Mario Kart ride.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like stuff like that makes more sense because it's controlled, right? Like a controlled environment where you experience it for like 10 to 15 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever. I think is going to be a lot more satisfying. Like I said, I think that's generally the most satisfying VR experiences are limited ones. But again, it's like, I don't know. The technology is so young that like it could go a lot of different ways. But I don't know. Like I wonder if Sony's going to stick around for the long haul. Because I know when they launched PSVR 2, they talked a lot about how they looked at it the same way they looked at when they launched the PlayStation 1, where it's like this is the first step in like the next 20 years of Sony, right? We're investing in this market because we believe it's a big future in technology, and we want to be part of it, right? But I don't know, like.
Yeah, but when was like the last released PSVR game from them? I can't really remember them making money internally.
I mean, they didn't really, but I don't think that's necessarily what they were talking about. Like they're talking more about technology.
Yeah. Well, and they've nailed it with the technology in the VR too. So I think if people are looking for a VR headset, I could also see if they're just like, oh, sales are stagnant, they're not selling as much as we wanted. You just go, it works with PC now, and then it opens up to a whole other market, and you're now the best PC VR headset on the market, and you've got access to all of the games that are on Steam that just work with any headset, and I think you could do that. So there is possibility there. I think it's too early to call. I am regretting not going ahead with that prediction. I know probably we would have argued the toss about it of like PSVR 2 will underperform or whatever it was. It was just like, because this story pretty much
that was one of my predictions, right? But it's like, how do you, what is underperformance, right? What does that mean? Sony's not going to say it underperformed, right? So,
yeah.
But I don't know. I hope it works out, right? Because like, I'm not a VR person, but I would like to be. I would like to like everything. That is generally my personality, right? I want to get excited about things. I want to enjoy new technology. I was excited about VR at the launch of VR, and I feel like it has not lived up to the promise. I would love to see a company come to a point where they can deliver a headset and experiences where I'm like, you can't ignore this, right? Like in the way that I feel like I need a PlayStation, I need a Nintendo, I need an Xbox, right? If I want to have the best experiences in the best way, I want there to be a VR headset that feels that essential. And I don't know. I don't know that we get there. I don't know that VR stays a gaming centric thing forever. I think you're right.
No, I don't think it will. I think it eventually will become a general computing platform.
And probably more oriented towards social stuff. I think that makes more sense. But I don't know. I think it's so nebulous that it could really go in a lot of ways. And I hope that Sony doesn't get gun shy in the way that they did with like the Vita, right? Where they're like, we made some mistakes here. This isn't working. Rather than trying to pivot and make it work, they kind of just dropped it and moved on. And I hope they don't do that with VR.
Yeah, me too. It would be a real shame.
So we're going to close this episode out with a little update around the PS5 sales, because we've talked a bit in the last couple weeks about how, I guess we didn't touch on it too much. It was kind of a weird story that was in between two episodes where the PlayStation 5 stock issue is becoming less and less prevalent. It's getting easier and easier to get your hands on a PlayStation 5.
We did talk about this. We spoke about how Sony basically declared the end of it. I can't remember which episode it was on. I think it was the first one.
We touched on it.
Maybe the end of the last year. It was like, it's not going to be a thing anymore.
And as a result, the console is actually selling a lot better. There were 7.15 million PS5 consoles sold in the 3 months ending in December 2022. So that means from October through December, which is up 83% from the previous years in that same quarter, right? Christmas 2021, which is huge. That's a huge increase. That's a really big change. Overall, we've now crossed 32 million PS5 consoles worldwide, which 3 years in, pretty good, right? Like that's nothing to sneeze at.
Yeah, it's really good. It's not quite on track with the trajectory of the PS4, which had sold 38 million at this point. But obviously it's different.
Supply constraints weren't a problem with the PS4. You could just get a PS4, exactly. Right? Like that was really not a problem. So you got to imagine that number will probably start to kind of even out now that supply is more available, because obviously the demand has been there, right? There's been a lot of people who've wanted one and couldn't get it. The question, I guess, is now, do they still have money to get it? Does that influence things at all? It might. But I think, to take it back to something you said earlier, I think video game consoles are one of the things that are kind of recession-proof. because video games are the best ROI in terms of dollar spent versus hour enjoyed.
Yeah,
right?
Especially when you consider free-to-play games dominate, and it's just like, oh, I buy the console and I can play Fortnite with my friends for hours and hours and hours.
Mm-hmm. And then again, right? Like you get some free games month to month. Maybe you get in on the streaming service, right? Like there are options for you to eke out time on your PlayStation that really don't cost you much, or they cost you nothing, right?
Yeah, if you buy if you buy the one with the disc drive, you can go buy some used games as well. It's always an option, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I agree with you. I think consoles are pretty recession proof. People will be like, okay, well, we can't afford to go out for dinner every single month. Let's invest that money in playing a game instead and getting a console.
Right.
And we can sell our old console and recoup some of the money when we invest it in the new one.
Especially if you have kids, right? Like I think during a recession, like that's a really tough thing where it's like, okay, like money's tight now. We don't have a huge recreation budget to take the kids out and go do stuff, let alone the fact that like there's still a pandemic going on, right? So like there are a lot of people that are gun shy about that stuff with their kids anyway, because young kids, like obviously, their immuno situation is often very in flux when they're young, so you can imagine that like that's probably why Nintendo Switch sales have been so absolutely dominant, even though that console is old at this point, there are probably a lot of kids that are like coming into the age of like being old enough to play games, and this is like one of the few things that you can safely do. Not to mention the fact that like, and I don't know if this is the case in your country, but at least in America, there's been a trend the last several years of like really limiting spaces where children can like find community and interact, right? Like when I was a kid, like you could go and hang out at the mall on the weekends, and like my understanding is that like that's kind of frowned upon now, and like kids are getting in trouble for like loitering and like hanging out in places and not spending money.
I don't know about that.
That's the thing I've seen anecdotally on Twitter from like adults with parents. So I, grain of salt, but I know that like a big part of the success of Fortnite is that kids play Fortnite to hang out. Like they jump on Discord and they just
that's absolutely what
around.
it is. It's something to do with friends. Yeah, it's just a place to be.
Because they don't have places they can go.
To do that. Yeah. And granted, you don't need a PS5 to be able to do that. You can play that on a potato, and you'd be absolutely fine with Fortnite.
Yeah, for sure. But I guess my point is more just like I think that's why gaming doesn't ebb and flow the same way, because like it's expensive as hell to go see a movie, right? Like you buy even a $70 boxed video game and you play the thing all the way, you get 40 to 60 hours of entertainment out of God of War, right? You could get 20 to 40 hours out of Spider-Man, that's a really good ROI, especially if you buy the game on sale. Right? If you're not concerned about playing what's new.
Wait till people find out about Game Pass over on the other side of the fence,
Yeah.
I mean, I can pay $7.99 and get 120 hours out of this one game, Persona 5. Sure.
Yeah, right. And I mean, we'll see, right? Because I think this year might be the year where Xbox starts to close the gap with, the Redfalls, and not really probably Redfall as much, but Starfield, right? Is like that. If Starfield delivers the way it's supposed to, it's going to be one of the big games of the year, and I think a lot of people will pick up an Xbox to play it.
If not the game of the year, we'll have to wait and see.
Could be. Really could be. And, we don't know, right? There's that whole rumor that, like, they wanted another delay, and there's back and forth about it. So it's like the game could come in hot and not live up to expectations and whatever, but it also might. So going to be an interesting question. So to wrap up on this one, right? Sony has said that they feel confident that they can continue to keep the PS5 in stock, and they actually raised the target sales up to 19 million, which is up by 1 million units from what was previously expected. So that means that before March 31st of this year, Sony expects to sell at least another 6.2 million PlayStation 5s, and to continue that, that trajectory, into the next, year and change. Not to mention the fact that we have the redesign coming, which should also potentially contribute to that, right?
Yeah, well, the alleged redesign, we'll have to wait to see if that comes true. I'm interested to see what they do with pricing on that in the UK, because obviously we had, and the rest of the world, other than you guys, the rest of the world had a price increase. I'm interested to see if they keep that price at where it is, but remove the disk drive, or if they kind of just like, well, the base price is now the digital edition price, and you can tack this on. But if that tacked on drive costs more than the current version, if you know what I mean,
Yeah,
like, does
yeah,
that cost more than the disc edition? I don't know.
could be. I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. Like that makes sense to me on paper, right?
Yeah, I could see them charging like $100 for the or £100 for that drive, and like extra thing for it to come in. Um,
Yeah, that feels right.
whereas I think it's like an £80 difference at the moment, if I remember correctly.
So then, aside from that, they also had a small increase in PlayStation Plus subscriber numbers. It's up from 40.5 million at the end of last year to 46.6. The peak that they hit was 48 million before they launched the new tiers. But again, this is, when they announced this before, they lost subscribers, but they increased profitability thanks to the new tiers. So the fact that that number is like slowly climbing seems like they made the right call. If this holds true.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm gonna imagine that's only gonna grow as they sell more PlayStations.
Seems that way, right?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they announced that the PlayStation Plus collection is going to be discontinued as of May 9th. The nice thing is that if you are already a PlayStation 5 owner, you can add all of those games to your library and retain your access to them. Obviously, bit of a disappointment for like newer players who are, if you get your PS5 like this holiday season, you unfortunately won't be able to take advantage of that anymore, which I think sucks. That is a thing that we kind of thought might happen when they announced this new tier system, because I think there's kind of a little bit of cannibalization between those two things, but it's a shame. I thought the PS Plus collection was like a really good value proposition, like early
Yeah, and I
on.
feel like they could have put that. Yeah, I guess maybe I don't know if all those games are in the middle tier. I think they probably are anyway, so maybe it doesn't really
I think
matter.
so.
But it is disappointing because you don't get to kind of keep them as part of your library. Whereas, like before, if you claimed them and then they took them off the service, you still got to play the game. Whereas now, like, because those games kind of fluctuate, who knows if Persona is going to come back to it, whereas it was
Well,
there
that's the thing. If you
before.
claim it, you'll keep it, is my
Yeah, yeah,
understanding.
but what I mean is like now they've got this sort of current ongoing subscription service with PlayStation Plus Premium. Do I, those games aren't eternal. They're not going to be there
Right.
forever. I don't claim them. They're there for me to download and play in the same way they are on Game Pass, and games kind of move around from those services all the time.
Yeah, unfortunately. So that's definitely a disappointment. It makes sense, I think, when you like think about the why of it, but it's a bummer. I don't think it's not a bad decision per se, but I think it's a bad look, because I think it was a really, really cool, attractive thing that they offered, and I think it was a really good incentive for you to pick up a PlayStation and have some games that you could just jump into right away.
Mm-hmm.
But say la vie. The last update on this side of the fence is that we got an update on God of War Ragnarok sales. As of the report, it has sold 11 million copies, which is
Yeah,
pretty dang good considering it just dropped 2 months ago. 3 months ago, I
yeah.
guess.
As of February 1st, Sony Santa Monica announced on their Twitter account that it was they sold 11 million copies.
So they got to be pretty happy about that.
Yeah. How many more is it going to sell when it comes to PC this year?
Probably, I mean, right? Like, I don't know. I fully expect this to pass 25 million units in the next,
Yeah, it's a big game.
year or so. Yeah, it's a big game, and I mean, obviously, it was very warmly received critically as well. So, I mean, that's gonna help. So yeah, big times for Sony right now. I think, despite the fact that, like we said, this I think on the onset it seems like a quieter year. I think they're in a really strong position right now, and I'm sure there's a reason that they're being quiet. Right? Is like I don't feel like there's a lot of pressure on them to talk right now. Their consoles selling faster than they can make it, and there's no shortage of attractive software on the platform for new players, right? Like God of War just came out, so I'm sure that if we've got to sit in our hands for a couple of months while we wait for Spider-Man, like I think the average user is probably not too bothered by that, so.
Yeah, plus, that like assumes that there's no third-party games coming, which we know there is. Just, Resident Evil 4 is right around the corner. We've just had Dead Space remake drop. There's like a lot of stuff. Yeah, okay, that maybe not that one. But there's Final Fantasy 16 due out this year, so there's like a lot of stuff kicking around.
Right. And you got to imagine that's going to be a big one, and that's a game that has a heavy association with PlayStation. People are going to play that on PlayStation more than anywhere else, probably.
Yeah, I think it's exclusive to PlayStation.
Oh, shoot, you might be right. Probably timed, right? But still.
Yeah, and probably coming to PC day and date like Forspoken, but yeah.
Maybe. I'm not sure, because the last Final Fantasy didn't. It came to PC later, and it had like a big moment when it came to PC. And like maybe, Forspoken shows that that's not the case anymore, but it'll be.
Well, yeah, who knows?
It'll definitely be a big one, right? That's going to be a heavy hitter this year, assuming that it comes out on time.
Yeah, it's PlayStation only, not announced for PC yet, but it will be coming at some point.
I imagine it'll probably come to PC next year, or a year after, right? I think that was what happened with Final Fantasy 15. And they had like all the DLC and everything. It was like a big
7 remake.
7 remake did the same thing. Yep. Yeah. So there you go. If you want to write in and let us know what you thought about all of the announcements from Sony this week, or the stuff you'd like to see from them in 2023 and beyond, make sure you write into the show. FlipScreen.games is the website. Come join the Discord. Keep the conversation rolling over there. We collect questions over there. You can write into the show. We did have some questions in the question block today, but obviously we're running a little long on this one, so we're going to bank those for next week. So make sure you write in with your questions too. Maybe we'll do like a mailbag episode. It's been a minute.
Yeah, in particular, Sobi's question was a really cool concept this week.
It's a doozy.
We'll definitely touch it.
Yeah, and I want to give it the time it deserves, not rush through it at the end of the show. So we'll save that one for next week. So yeah, make sure you write in with your questions as well, and we can dive into those for next week's show. So thank you guys for joining us here on another episode of the FlipScreen Games podcast. For the crew, I've been Pete. He's been Steve. We'll see you next week.